Hello, my name is Bernard Eisbrenner. I am based in Plymouth, Michigan, near Detroit, and I have a background in energy efficiency software, primarily around behavioral energy efficiency programs. I started a company out of university called Carbon Cash, which was uh, a behavioral energy efficiency software that targeted renters, specifically young renters and low-income renters, to try to incentivize them to reduce or shift their energy consumption strategically to benefit the grid and also to benefit themselves. And then I went on to work for a company called Co., which is based in Glasgow, Scotland. I've been in the United States, but I've helped them with integrating with several utilities in the United States, as well as some commercial real estate customers. It's also an energy efficiency software company that focuses on commercial real estate, carbon reporting, building energy optimization, that sort of thing. And part of what they've done has been around indoor air quality sensing. They've integrated that into their product suite, and that's part of how I came to become involved in this particular conference, and I'm happy to do so. This talk that I'm giving today is based on a concept that I first had the inspiration for years ago, actually. I was at a conference in San Francisco. I think it was a climate conference anyway, and we had a booth there for Arbor Co. And while I was at our booth, I was approached by a gentleman who's a California energy commissioner, and he expressed to me that he was really concerned about the health impacts that were being felt by poor indoor air quality. So in California, the context is usually kind of wildfire driven, but he more broadly, he was really concerned about it, and he felt some level of frustration that uh, as an energy commissioner, the ability to address that particular problem didn't quite fall within his regulatory purview. And he just kind of said, it'd be great if I could do something, but I just don't know how. And I sat with it for a little while. I was sitting at the booth, and it then occurred to me this concept of what if we could frame this as a problem that could be addressed through something that an energy commissioner would have authority over. And what I thought of was another problem that was directly in his purview, and that was what's called the so-called duck curve in California's grid. So I'll go into that in greater depth, but effectively it is solar overgeneration, solar electricity with no work to do at a given time. So it's all around timing and also aligning various stakeholders to kind of optimize uh, the activities that they do to achieve multiple benefits at once. Kill two birds with one stone, however you want to put it. Essentially, it is a way to address what some people call a split incentive problem. Uh, and we'll get into that a little bit more deeply. But that's how I first came to this idea. And it's kind of sat in my head for a while. And I haven't really found it being pursued in that specific combination. And so this was actually very timely. I was happy that you reached out and allowed me to talk about this, and it gave me an excuse to research it and think about it a little bit more in depth. So hopefully we can kind of detail it effectively here. So, yeah, two problems, one window. The idea is obviously on the one hand we have increasing health impacts from poor indoor air quality. So 2 to 5 times higher indoor air pollutants than outdoor levels on average. It's no surprise to any American that we spend most of our time indoors. the vast majority of us and the vast majority of our time. So it compounds over time, poor air quality. Baltimore in particular, as here we say 2 times the state average for asthma hospitalization, 3 times the national asthma hospitalization rate. And, speaking to you, Aaron, at the beginning of this, you pointed out that Baltimore, as of this year, I think you said, has the highest nationally. So uh, that's a very poignant issue for people in Maryland and Baltimore in particular. And on the other hand, we have wasted solar. Effectively, that's solar electricity that is generated but does not power any productive work. Um, and that's a shame, but that's what happens. So we have in the California ISO, and California is, just to give a little bit of a uh, foreshadowing here. California and their grid ISO stands for Independent System Operator. They are, I think, indicative of what Maryland and PJM are likely to face in the coming years as they bring on more renewables and solar to meet uh, their targets. So, anyways, California ISO had to curtail about 3.4 million megawatt hours of solar in 2024. So that just means that they effectively had to tell those solar generators not to generate electricity during that time because it would just there's nowhere for it to go. It was going to strain the grid. PJM, which is the ISO that serves Maryland and several other states throughout the Midwest and Northeast, has seen curtailment jump around sixfold in 2024, 57 gigawatts of new solar generation is in PJM's pipeline. So that's to come on in the next several years. Uh, as you can see, Maryland has a target for 50% renewables by 2030, and I think that's roughly of that 50%, something like 15 to 20 is uh, mandated to be solar. So there are parallels between CAISO and PJM for Maryland. But the thing about these two problems that I think this solution that I'm proposing um, highlights is that they do share a solution window, as I have it written here, and it's about the time and a place and a given day in the grid's operation and the operation of a building, and it's mostly commercial buildings. That's where I'm targeting because those will be the most likely to have the hardware and systems necessary to implement this kind of strategy, but it could be other buildings, residential, etc. It could be adapted for different use cases, but essentially the solar overgeneration happens midday, usually sunny days, spring, summer, fall, where the sun is at its zenith in the sky and it's hitting solar panels with the most energy, and then solar panels have the maximum output. Just so happens to be at a time of day where um, demand is at its lowest. There's nowhere for that electricity to go. And also, there are buildings that are kind of getting to the point where they're needing to run they're having to do the most cooling work, or they're about to have to do that. It's kind of the peak heat of the day. It's also right around lunchtime, so it's when people aren't always in the building. So there's a bit of a potential mm, synchronicity between these two that I think hasn't really been explored in any great depth. So the solution, the idea is, what if we used the
Mm.
surplus clean energy to flush fresh air into buildings and pre-cool them using the existing hardware? So many solutions that you'll hear to both of these problems will often require the either the development or the installation or purchase of some new hardware software system. That's very often the case. This particular one, what I'm proposing is to just utilize what is already available in a different way. So, as it's pointed out here, this is more of a scheduling uh, challenge than it is more of a hardware challenge. Certain buildings will require it, but I think it's really about, like it says here, connecting the grid signals, the signals that are happening on the ISO, the wholesale electricity market, with these ventilation control signals. If we can start to align those, I think we can really tap into serious benefits for from both perspectives, both the grid and indoor air quality. I think uh, hopefully I can outline how this could work a little bit later, but just to kind of help give scope to the size of the problem. In terms of indoor air quality, EPA's cited that there's somewhere around 2 to 5 times the level of pollutants in indoor in buildings versus outdoor levels, and that's uh, controlled or weighted for anywhere in the country. That's a national average. We spend most of our time indoors. It's just the air we breathe all day. Um, the more you have greater odds of having these health issues, the more even carbon dioxide, never mind volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, etc. Just CO2 alone has a serious impact. So, see, asthma hospitalization rates are alarmingly high in Baltimore, and it's a serious issue. Uh, it affects low-income zip codes disproportionately. So it is something that you know it's has a social aspect to it as well. Higher household ventilation associated with lower coughs, phlegm, bronchitis, wheezing. I personally, for like the last 2 weeks, I've been coughing and wheezing and having, congestion in my chest. And when you feel like that, it drags you down for sure. You're not performing at 100% efficiency, certainly from an intellectual point of view or physical. If you're trying to go for a run when you've got a chest cold or something, you're going to be heaving. So this does have a cost, and that's part of what I wanted to try and grasp. Um, there was an interesting study done by Harvard's Chan School regarding the potential impacts of indoor air quality on cognitive performance.
Mhm.
So they had categorized different buildings. They had a baseline type building that had, I guess you would call traditional levels of indoor air quality. And then they had green and green plus, which were effectively buildings that had implemented strategies and technologies to optimize indoor air quality. And these are the relative results. I think they had several dozen people that they did this with over the course of like 9 weeks or something. But you can see that higher cognitive scores in the best buildings were double what they were for other buildings. So that's pretty remarkable. And the cost benefit ratio. So what they were saying is that to double the ventilation, which is roughly what green plus means, would cost about $40 per person per year for like occupants of the building. Um, versus what the productivity gain should be of around $6,500 per person per year. And by productivity gain, they reckoned if your cognitive scores are double, your ability to focus, your ability to do productive work, etc., go up substantially, and reduced absenteeism. So something like 6,500 to 7,500 or $7,000 increase in productivity. As you can see, the ratio 150 to 1 is substantial. And, even if you had like a regular standard deviation of that, I mean, it's really remarkable what that uh, benefit to cost ratio is. And so that's with a $40 per person per year cost. This solution is looking at using, and that $40 is the electricity, the energy to power the work to ventilate the building. If we could put this electricity that's being generated by solar, which is otherwise going to waste or being prevented from being put on the grid, to work doing this ventilation, that ratio goes up even more. It's effectively free energy. It wouldn't, in real terms, necessarily be free. There would be some cost for the transmission, etc. But um, it would effectively be free. It's uh, what I call solar salvage. So there's a resource, solar electricity being generated, which is not being taken advantage of because we just simply have kind of outpaced our ability to take advantage of it. So I think that's something that uh, could be really powerful, especially with the health impacts alone. And I know I put this in the productivity kind of framing, but it's just a way to kind of give to quantify what the potential benefit would be. And with that product, it doesn't say here what the potential health impacts in terms of lowering asthma rates, et cetera, would be. I didn't quantify that, but I imagine that they could be similar in terms of the cost benefit ratio could be really impactful. So the duck curve is an opportunity, not just a problem. That gets to my point about this solar salvage idea. Um, Here we kind of have a picture of how much solar is having to be curtailed and what this trend has been. So uh, it jumped sixfold in California's ISO from 2023 to 2024. Um, 5.4 to 8 gigawatts solar during 2024. You see this jump in price and the capacity price. In this particular point where it says capacity price $29 to $329 megawatt a day, that is in PJM's ISO, their market. And it reflects a projected demand increase from data centers effectively to supply enough electricity to bring that level of capacity into the market. So it's signaling that there is a need for new generation and that there's going to be price increases. And like you were saying earlier, Aaron, I believe you said Maryland has the highest electricity costs for consumers in the whole country.
Mhm.
And so this is all part, I mean, all the consumers, et cetera, will be affected by capacity costs. They get passed on to the customer. So uh, there is an economic cost to this as well. But yeah, you can see that just the amount of uh, gigawatt hours of solar having to be curtailed. This is having to basically be prevented from delivering their electricity onto the grid, onto the transmission lines, because at that point in time when it's producing its peak amount of solar, there's not enough demand, and this just travels and clogs the wires, so to speak. There's nowhere for it to go, and so the cost of it having to be distributed is greater than the value it would deliver because there's no demand for it, and therefore, at least in California's case, you'll see prices actually go negative for this uh, resource. So that's kind of the scope of it. Now, the context that we are looking at to try and address these two problems, which are buildings. Buildings account for over 70% of electricity um, in the United States. There's projected massive savings from kind of flexible load technologies being implemented in buildings nationwide. Uh, Annual carbon dioxide reduction from these types of strategies could be as high as 6%. Um, this is all to say that there there's a recognized and growing consensus on the impact that having flexible load could have just in regards to the grid alone. So you can see some of these studies that I've cited, um, 25 to 50% cooling load reduction during peak hours. Uh, you know, these are demand reduction studies but they're looking at how much they can shed or sorry, not just reduce, but shed or shift their load for ventilation and cooling from one point of the day to another point of the day. And you're seeing large impacts, 40 to 60% demand reduction during peak pricing, ventilation flexibility, 30 to 40% HVAC, cooling demand flexibility for ventilation, rate adjustment, and humid climates, New York, Atlanta, which Maryland's a relatively humid climate, similar as well. So you could see similar impacts there. And th this is also just a quick note. Um, I haven't found in my research a a study or a program that has connected these things in the way that I'm proposing here. Uh, that's not to say that everything I'm saying is novel, not at all. What I'm saying is different elements of what I'm proposing have been validated and have been tested in different contexts. But back to how I had the idea in the first place with the energy commissioner, it's often the case that so many of these things are siloed. They don't often have the benefit of someone looking at them from a 30,000 foot level, etc., thinking about how they can be aligned. It's like, never the two shall meet kind of a thing. So that's kind of what I'm finding and piecing these together from different studies. So that gets to generally how I envision this probably working. Like I said, I haven't seen a pilot or study that has implemented this, but there are pieces of it that have worked, and based on those kind of a synthesis of those different things, this is how I imagine it working. So you would have different sensors measuring different um, data points, and each of those would have a signal that would feed into the decision to uh, execute this uh, work of extra ventilation or pre-cooling the building. So first would be the grid status. Is the grid curtailing solar? Are energy prices for this near zero or negative? And you could get that from the ISO, locational pricing nodes, time of use rates, etc. Marginal emissions as well could be another indicator, but there's pretty robust real-time data that you can get to indicate and use as a signal. Then indoor versus outdoor air quality. I know I said earlier that the EPA study on average said that indoor is usually 2 to 5 times more pollutant heavy than outdoor air. But certain times and places of the day, it's not always the case. For instance, in California during wildfire season, outdoor may be worse than indoor. So you would have sensors for both, you know, carbon dioxide, VOCs, PM, 2.5, etc. Uh, there's different things that you could use, different sensors, but that would be the general idea, indoor versus outdoor, comparing the two. And then afternoon temperature forecast. This gets to the uh, third component, which is the pre-cooling element. So the first element is the grid market signal. Is the electricity there to do the work, the surplus electricity there to do the work, to be salvaged, if you will. Second is, does the outdoor air quality uh, justify being flushed into the building? Should we run the air ventilation and flush the air during this time? And then third is based on the temperature differentials and the forecasted demand for cooling the building later that day, does it make sense to pre-cool the building during this window of time when we have surplus solar that we can use to do that work and basically help reduce the ventilate or the cooling demand later in the day. So this we have the fresh air flush scenario. So we use the surplus solar, and it would work probably best with an economizer from what I've looked at, where this is more or less kind of what I'm describing, where it's able to sense the differentials between indoor outdoor air quality and kind of make a decision as to how to run the ventilation and flush that air in and out. It would be around noon, lunchtime. So it kind of coincides with the working day a little bit. This is kind of why I like it. It's all about there's a rhythm to this, and I can see these things lining up. Uh, Carbon dioxide could drop from 1,200 parts per million to 600 parts per million in 17 minutes or so. Uh, if done properly, it could vary, but it's indicative of what could be done. Uh, Reduce the CO2 levels, indoor air quality improves, and then the grid gets to shed or send some of this excess solar somewhere. And at scale, it could be significant. But you know, right now, the main solution to that side of the problem is that's being proposed is battery storage, which is great. It's just it's expensive. It takes time to deploy these things as a grid resource, and they are they're just not able to scale at the rate that solar generation is scaling. Uh, it's being outpaced by the generation. The pre-cool and store, again, you know, during lunchtime, I could easily see, well, you know, occupancy rate of the building lowers. You can cool the building an extra couple of degrees if you know that you're going to have to run the cool it again in 2, 3 hours. People come back, and then the thermostat floats back up, and it kind of evens out that curve a little bit. Right. So this is just kind of a graph, or not a graph, a graphic of what the decision logic looks like. Pretty much what I just described, but it's just about uh, systematizing this in a way that can integrate with building automation systems and the HVAC systems to actually execute this and to get the grid signal as well. So Maryland code, this is an important bit, requires economizers for commercial cooling uh, over 54,000 BTU an hour, so 5 tons. So there are economizers out there in commercial buildings in Maryland right now. Right. So back to the demand response side of this, there's traditional demand response is usually there's different types of demand response resources generally recognized. There's uh, shed, which is the probably the most commonly understood version of demand response, where that's basically just reducing your demand at a given point in time in response to a signal from the grid, uh, just to lower overall demand on the grid. Then there's shift, where you take that demand that would have taken place during this peak signal period, and then you just simply uh, have that demand later in the day. So say instead of running your dishwasher at lunchtime or whenever or at evening, you'd wait and you run your dishwasher in the middle of the night. Or with many people with electric vehicles will be familiar with time of use rates, so they would do it at night. That's generally how demand response is thought about, where it's about either reducing or shifting your load away from times of peak demand. This is a little nuanced, and another form of demand response resource, which is relatively new, is usually called take, and that basically means uh, planning or shifting your demand from a certain time of day to when there's going to be peak generation or oversupply, like I'm talking about. What proposing here is not necessarily a take, uh, in the sense that this demand, take demand normally means that this amount of demand would occur regardless at some point during the day. It's just simply timing it to take place when the generation is oversupplied. What I'm saying is we are increasing overall demand. We're creating a new demand to power additional work, productive work during that to take advantage of the oversupply. That's why I call it salvage because I really struggled to think of a way to encapsulate it, and I thought salvage was a good way because it's a productive activity that's taking advantage of an underutilized resource. So that's the idea.
I like repurposed.
Repurpose, exactly. Yep, that's good too. I'm a sucker for alliteration though, so solar salvage just hit my brain. Anyway, so yeah, there's yeah, what one event cycle delivers, and so this is again, this is the first time I've really put a lot of focused research thought into this concept, and I've been pulling from multiple different studies. So this is just indicative of, I think, what could be done. I think a lot more research and pilot testing needs to be done to really uh, validate everything and get a more accurate picture, but I think this is indicative of what would occur. So a couple hours during the middle of the day, uh, you see roughly, you know, it says 50 to 70 kilowatts for a fan, maybe a couple hundred for cooling. You're looking at, half a megawatt maybe for, 50,000 square foot office. You're avoiding emissions. Now, there's a caveat to that with the emissions avoidance, and that is that just because the additional solar is doing productive work, there's 2 points that have to be considered there with emissions. And the first is that, as I'm proposing it, this is work that wasn't necessarily going to be done otherwise. So we're adding additional work to take advantage of the solar. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that work would be done at a different point in the day when the electricity is coming from gas or coal. Could, but not necessarily. The other part is that during these times of peak generation, even though demand is low, uh, it doesn't mean that the solar that's over generating is replacing uh, coal or natural gas generation in the mix. The mix ratio changes, but there's still the same amount of coal being burned for that amount of demand. And the reason is for capacity requirements. So to keep the coal fire power plant and to keep the natural gas generators functioning in a way that if demand spiked, they could deliver that demand instantaneously. Because if they powered down, it takes time for them to ramp back up, and then the capacity to service an increase in demand is not there. So it's like an insurance policy kind of for the grid. Those are just factors to keep in mind when it comes to emissions. But I do think that there would be an emissions impact. It's just that it would take some more serious study to really understand it. But yeah, and then the biggest one is the productivity value. And that kind of also encapsulates the health value. I didn't quantify in dollar terms what I think the health value would be, but I just used the productivity value as kind of a proxy for that. But 150 to 1 cost benefit ratio, I think that could be translated to health as well. Again, more research and studies needed. So Maryland's building stock. So Maryland has something like 9,000 uh, buildings over 35,000 square feet covered under the Building Energy Performance Standard. So that's a lot. That's a lot of square footage. There's a lot that could be done with that. And I know you mentioned that I wasn't actually aware of this, that Baltimore and Maryland has some of the oldest you
Mhm.
know, building stock in the country that's still in use. So there's a lot of room for improvement. There's a lot that could be done with that. These aren't necessarily all brand new buildings. There could be high payout for some of these strategies. Uh, South Atlantic buildings are all electric, roughly 40%, which is pretty high. Um, Average year built 1981. Again, that's relatively a low or old age for the average. Um, but uh, Peak load contribution, so this is a pricing thing for these types of buildings. Every kilowatt you shift from 5 p.m. to noon uh, doesn't just save the time of use rate differential. So they have five peak hours. So uh, annually, I guess there's five peak hours for Baltimore Gas and Electric where they kind of set your rate going forward based on what your demand is during those 5 hours. That basically, if you shift your or lower your demand during these five peak hours, that you get a signal for ahead of time or on day of. I'm not sure how they signal, but if you are over a certain threshold or under a certain threshold, that's going to impact what your rate is going forward. Kind of like understanding what your share of the capacity is, and then they charge you for it concurrently. So that's the idea. Maryland Climate Solutions Now Act targets 60% greenhouse gas reduction by 2031, which is pretty aggressive. Uh, you got the Building Energy Performance Standard requires net zero by 2040, also aggressive. So that means there's going to be a lot more solar and renewable coming online quickly, relatively speaking. Empower goals shifted to greenhouse gas reduction. So there's an emphasis on the climate impact here in Maryland. Here's a general outline for how this might be approached by an implementer or a program designer. Uh, do an audit of the building in terms of what kind of hardware and sensors are available to do this kind of work. If they don't have it, you can install CO2 sensors, VOC, etc. To do that. Look at the programs that are available from the local utility, what the rate structure is for the building. Uh, do a baseline. So what's the load shape for the building? What's the HVAC share of that load? What's the indoor air quality like? How does it compare to the outdoor air quality there, etc. Um, you know, how what type of timing would be suitable for that building? What the occupancy is another part. And then design a pilot. So uh, I think how do I say this? The core thing for this model is really just to flush the air. That's the main thing. Pre-cooling is a nice thing to add. That has more of a grid benefit than a health benefit, but I think the main thing is just the ventilation. And so if you can do that, that would be great just for at least for a pilot to prove the concept. And then from there, scale it out. Like I mentioned earlier, the building code in Maryland requires buildings, I think it was over 50,000 square feet, larger buildings, to have these economizers. Um, and to have the kind of the hardware and building automation systems that would make this achievable. So, and the general trend, anyways, is that there's more of this technology, building automation technology, building controls, HVAC controls being deployed in more and more buildings because it's become cheaper. Electricity's gone up, the price has gone up, so the incentive to put this in has gone up, so there's more of it. Uh, then you got to go and integrate this across building portfolios, maybe. So for like a real estate investment trust that has a bunch of buildings, maybe you do it across our campus, etc. You work with the utilities and see if there's a way to, it would require a lot of pilot testing, but you can integrate this into a utility scale pilot or into some program design. It could be a good way to scale it. So yeah, this is basically what I was just kind of talking about. Time of use rates, I think, is something that people in the general public are more and more uh, aware of, especially people who have electric vehicles and deal with charging electric vehicles. There's rates that are specific to them, but it's more widespread. Schedule it for off-peak, peak uh, generation, etc. You can see actual, you could potentially see actual reductions in electricity costs for the end user, the building owner. Depends on how the time of use rate works, but that's a possibility. Um, Building management systems, again, the sensors, the logic, we've gone over that. Uh, we have signal driven activities. There are some things, like OpenADR is interesting. It's basically a framework that this type of program could fit within, which is likely to be adopted by, say, Baltimore Gas and Electric. It hasn't happened yet, but it's there. It could very well happen. I think it probably will, given the other policies that are being adopted in Maryland. It would fit, so it's just something to watch. And yeah, so building system installed, DR protocols exist, decision logic, the timing, and the lining up of these different problems. Thinking about these problems as being connected. That's the uh, fundamental thesis of this is that the problems themselves are connected and they share an overlapping solution window in that it's a time of day thing, like midday, when this peak solar happens. It's a nice window of opportunity to actually tackle both. So these are just people that archetypes of people that might be interested in this, building operators, people who own a building and they are concerned about occupant comfort, indoor air quality, if that's a priority for them, they might be interested in this kind of a strategy. Utility program managers, it could be something that as this solar curtailment problem uh, increases with more solar deployment, maybe this just genuinely could strike a chord with them. Policymakers, so people, in charge of public health, that sort of thing. This could be an interesting strategy for them. And, I just listed these as just a couple. There's other groups of people that could be interested in this. And really the thing is that I can't think of one group of, professionals, etc., that this would fall directly into their purview. It's a mesh of different groups, and that's why I think this has to be, policy. If this could be incorporated into policy, that would be a good way of making it happen at scale in the future. So that's the idea. Yeah, it's just using what's already there to try and do this productive work. But yeah, I these are the sources that I drew upon.
You have a few minutes for some questions?
Absolutely, yeah,
All right, cool. I've got more questions than time. This is very fascinating. We normally don't focus on kind of theoretical solutions. We're looking for more case studies and things that have been proven in the marketplace. However, The reason that I wanted you to come and speak is because the solution that you have, yes, there still needs to be some research, but the concept I think is very novel. And the only thing that comes close to what I've heard out there in the field, are you familiar with the architect Sir Norman Foster?
I'm not, no.
Okay, definitely encourage you to look him up. Sir Norman Foster, Foster and Partners. You've heard of the buildings that he's built. 425 Park Avenue in Manhattan, otherwise known as a building for the people. He's really big on, and he has been since the 60s, really big on buildings that have natural ventilation, natural, ways of purifying the air, and he constructs them in that sense so that they actually breathe. So the 425 Park Avenue, it's called the Building for the People, and then 270 Park Avenue is the newest skyscraper in Manhattan, the J.P. Morgan Chase building, and he was the architect for both of those. And um, Dr. Joseph Allen, who you quoted as part of the cog effect study from the T.H. Chan School of Public Health, was the consultant on the indoor air quality component. So definitely encourage you to check out Sir Norman Foster, and you can, find him on YouTube or what have you. But you mentioned the cog effect study, which is something that I'm very familiar with, and I'm glad that you made that a part of your presentation. I come to this space from reading Dr. Joseph Allen's Healthy Buildings book. I'm assuming that have you read that as well?
I've not read the book. No,
Okay,
this study was my first foray into his
that's
research.
so interesting. So interesting, but not a coincidence. So definitely grab his book. It's called Healthy Buildings. And I'm reading his book and fascinating. I was reading this during COVID, and he talks about how, radon comes from granite countertops. And I was just like, whoa. We just renovated our house, put in granite countertops, and he said you need to get one of these air quality monitors and that has a radon sensor in it and measure your radon. So I did. And I've been a real estate practitioner for 25 years, right? I know about radon in buildings, but I never thought to test my own home. So put the monitor in my bedroom. They say you're supposed to put it in the basement. I didn't know any better. I put it in my bedroom. Radon numbers off the chart. Now, it wasn't because of the granite countertops, it was because where I live is there's a lot of granite quarries around my community. So we just have a lot of rock under our homes. But we were measuring, 20, 15, 20 picocuries per liter of radon, and that equates to smoking 20 to 40 cigarettes a day. And we've been here for 25 years.
Wow.
So that's kind of how I got into this, learning about radon much more than they taught us in real estate school, right? And then actually learning about mitigation systems. And then, that spread into, well, what is particulate matter? What are volatile organic compounds? What is thermal health? CO2 and ventilation and proxies and those types of things. And a lot of that, took a lot of deep dives into Joseph Allen and his research. Um, I'm from Syracuse, New York, and the Cogafex study was done at the Center of Excellence at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York. And I actually visited that building for a conference. It was a green buildings conference. I take my air quality monitors with me everywhere.
Okay.
Um, I'm just a nerd like that. And it was funny because the building, even though it's the Center of Excellence, where they did the study, the building didn't perform as good as I would have hoped, even though they had an air purifier in the room. It was still struggling. That has nothing to do with the cog effect study because that was in a separate room than I was in. But it's a very fascinating study, and shouts out to everybody back home and at Syracuse University. So I just wanted to kind of set that as a baseline. Um, so when we're talking about solar, are we talking about maybe a building that's connected to a community solar project, or is this a building that has on-site renewables, or can it work either way?
I think it could work either way. For a building that has on-site renewables and perhaps like a microgrid or a community solar project.
Mhm.
It just depends. So, like for a microgrid, I think it would just essentially be the same phenomenon, just at a smaller scale. in terms of how the load and the demand are managed in the transmission and distribution. If it's going in the general grid, which is, I would say, the vast majority
Mhm.
of the solar generation, then it becomes something that the grid operator and the utility kind of have to be involved with at some level.
Mhm.
Specifically, the grid operator giving out the signal, the price signal or the emissions intensity signal, or to curtail the solar. Then that would then trigger this kind of strategy. So if you had it in a smaller microgrid kind of community solar scale, it would still physically most likely occur, because it's likely that the demand shape would be similar to what we see in the rest of the grid, most likely. And then you have the weather, the solar generation being similar. So yeah, it could be something that could be, like a campus,
Mhm.
perhaps, like a
Mhm.
large campus. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I went to Michigan State University,
Mhm.
and they're, a massive land grant college, one
Mhm.
big area. It's effectively like a city.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
They have their own power plant, their
Mhm.
own grid,
Mhm.
their own metering, etc.
Mhm.
They
Mhm.
have an interconnection with a larger utility, but they can manage their own
Mhm.
grid. So somewhere like that, it could
Mhm.
be an interesting place to pilot this for sure.
And battery storage, how does that play? I think you mentioned it, but I guess I want to ask you again, how does that play into can you use the energy that's accumulated in your battery storage cells to do the flush out as opposed to having to necessarily go back to the utility to do that? Could you kind
Mm,
of
That could be done. Yes.
okay. Hmm.
That could be one way of doing it. The the limiting factor is the availability of battery storage at a scale to do this at a
Hmm.
larger scale. So
Hmm.
trying to find citation here that I have in regards to the deployment s- uh, of batteries, grid level battery storage.
Hmm.
Hold on. Okay, here we go. Battery storage. So, so in California's ISO, solar accounted for, and this is in 2024, solar accounted for 93% of all curtailed energy generation.
Hmm.
So the midday net load dip has dropped by over 13.6 gigawatts between 2018 and 2025. Net load swung 24 gigawatts in April 2025. So net load is the total demand minus the amount of renewables generated. So if the demand is 30 gigawatts at say noon, and the amount of solar being generated is like 18 gigawatts, the net load is 12 gigawatts. So just it's indicating the mismatch between the demand and the generation at that time. So basically let's see, if there's 24 gigawatts like difference in a day, then you have to have batteries that can capture that excess generation and then deploy it later in the day when the demand is higher,
Hmm.
peaking usually around like 5, 7 p.m., something like that.
Hmm.
But sorry, I got distracted by myself. The storage, battery storage is growing fast. So it was 500 megawatts battery storage in 2020 for California ISO, and it was just over 13 gigawatts by early 2025. So at that, there's probably something like between 15 and 20 gigawatts of battery storage, grid level battery storage for California, but it's still not enough to deal with this net load differential. So they're still even increasing the amount that they have to curtail of solar generation because they're deploying so much solar uh, at a rate that the storage hasn't been able to keep up. Um, and that's just to say that it's not that the batteries aren't important. They are important.
Hmm.
It's just that I think it. it often gets thought of as a kind of a silver bullet,
Mm.
as we do with so many things, right? I think, I mean, I'm like many Americans. If I feel sick, the first thing I think of is I go to the pharmacy, I get a, Motrin or cough medicine, and I get over it. When really, it's a combination of things. It's probably the fact that my indoor air quality isn't that great. Maybe it's because I haven't exercised that much. Maybe it has something to do with my diet as well. There's a combination of things, and I think that.
The buckshot as opposed to a silver bullet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that if they approach it with some of these kind of, you know, strategies to shift the load around, be smarter with what we have, I think it could help improve that.
The reason I asked the question is because I'm working with a historic African American church in Rockville, Maryland. Shouts out to Mount Calvary Baptist Church, and or that property is subject to, the Montgomery County Building Energy Performance Standard. It's about 38,000 square feet, and we're working on a microgrid kind of resiliency hub situation. Parking, solar parking canopies with EV charging to try to, generate additional revenue, and then, some rooftop solar. And so we started out that process just baselining both gross square footage verification, which is also extremely important in this process that I think is becoming a challenge because we're relying on public record data, which is totally inaccurate when it comes to square footage, because the footprint has changed so much of these structures. Floor plans don't even represent the actual square footage. But so we started out with a gross square footage verification via LiDAR scan. And then we also deployed these indoor air quality monitors to get a baseline on their indoor air quality, their filtration, ventilation, and how that was working, temperature, humidity. Luckily, no radon, but when they had service at 12 noon every Sunday, the numbers would start spiking because, as you know, being in indoor air quality, we are like mini pig pens. We from
Yeah.
Charlie Brown, right? We bring our own kind of stuff into a building, and then because it's a house of worship on Sundays, there's candles, there's incense, there's singing, choirs and things like that. So the carbon dioxide will spike, the VOCs will spike, the PM 2.5 will spike. But that would be a great scenario that, like, either during service or right before service, you just flush out the building.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we're talking to you, talked about, public health and engineering being very siloed, and they are. I see that in real time, and that's why, in a lot of these building energy performance standard laws, I'm looking for, okay, well, where are they going to address the health and wellness of the occupant? When am I going to see that? It's just totally non-existent. And the thought is that if you remove the combustibles, the healthy indoor air comes along for the ride. And of course, that's not always true. Measuring net zero buildings that have horrible air quality, buildings that have, gold, silver, platinum plaques, horrible air quality, right? And then you measure a building that's got natural gas and it's actually performing than the auto electric from an indoor air quality perspective, which I think is strange. But
Yeah.
I would think on a $35,000, excuse me, 35,000 square foot building that has its own microgrid, battery backup, that if there was enough there to be able to do a flush, for an hour or two during service might be a huge benefit that I don't even think folks are even thinking about. So that's why another reason why I like your angle on this.
Absolutely. And I think that's a clever use case. It hadn't occurred to me, but yeah, noon service, you're right. I mean, indoor air quality pollutants are going to spike with the different things that you mentioned, everyone being there, the candles, etc. And it's the right time of day, so if the weather's right and it could match the solar as well. But to your point, if they have their own battery storage, it doesn't necessarily have to be from the peak generation from solar. It could be simply just cheaper electricity if they have a time of use rate, or they have their own generation that they could take advantage of that, just move that to that time of day to do that flushing that you said. Yeah.
Yeah. So a few things. You mentioned indoor air quality being 2 to 5 times worse than outdoor air quality. We're seeing it up to 100 times worse. than air quality. We won a small, very small grant from BGE, our local utility, to be able to do what we call a 30-day healthy home checkup. So we'll deploy these monitors in people's homes for 30 days and checking for radon and asthma triggers. And the outdoor air quality in our region is fairly good, unless you live in an area like a Curtis Bay where we've got a lot of refineries and coal coming in on railroad cars. So they've got a big problem there in Curtis Bay. That's kind of neighborhood specific, but I would say the rest of, our region, outdoor air quality is actually pretty good. The EPA has been doing a great job of that for the last 30 years or so. When we have an occasional, Canadian wildfire, I'm sure you get the brunt of that. We get the brunt of it, but
Yeah.
it's not like California. So,
Yeah.
even when we're doing our initial walkthroughs at some of the homes prior to deploying the monitor, I always ask the question, do you open your windows? Um, I've gotten answers from I don't know how to open my windows. No, I've never opened my windows. Like the outdoor air is the devil. Like I've never opened my windows. It's just like there's this assumption that the outdoor air quality is the enemy when really it's what we produce on the indoors. And by keeping the home airtight, is causing the bigger problem. So I love the fact that about how you're again approaching this concept. What's been some of your research in regards to just barriers to adoption when it comes to people understanding that, aside from California and aside from a wildfire, which happens seasonally, uh, that indoor air quality is actually not as good as people think it is.
It's an interesting question. It you know, it's something that I would naturally gravitate towards because of my background with behavioral energy efficiency and trying to understand kind of the psychometrics, the way of measuring how do people make the decisions that they make, what are the motivating factors, underlying assumptions, that sort of thing. Um, because you're right. Uh, I think, just anecdotally from my own experience, people don't understand really the levels of pollutants that you have in indoor air, just from dust, from, just everything. And with outdoor air quality events like wildfires, um, it piques people's kind of uh, an interesting parallel here. There was a study that was done by a company called Opower, or anyways, they used to cite this study frequently, and I think they were bought by Oracle a long time ago, but they were a behavioral energy efficiency company, very successful 10, 15 years ago. And one of the things that they would often cite was that the average American spends less than 7 minutes a year thinking about how they use electricity. Um, So versus how much time we spend on Instagram or something like that. And I think air quality is got to be similar. I would be interested to research that and actually find out what kind of uh, metrics there are available on that out there. But it's got to be similar. It's just one of these things we take for granted. Just like, we flip the switch, the lights come on. You know, uh, you don't want to have
You can't
the
you can't see it, smell it, or taste it, so the air quality must be good, right?
Absolutely. It's imperceptible.
Right.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head, and that's why. Yeah.
Well, I would encourage you, Simon Jones, the
Yeah.
Air Quality Matters podcast. He's one of our guests as well. I got a chance to speak with him yesterday. He chimed in from Ireland. He has talked about in some of his one takes the psychology of air quality and just like in Ireland that has been notorious for high levels of radon. Like you couldn't give away a radon test to people. And then with that, so they got some funding to do the radon test, but then they found additional funding to be able to do mitigations. And some people are just like, I'm not even necessarily interested in that, even though I have high levels of radon. So it's kind of a quandary to figure out, kind of the psychology there. But he definitely addressed that on his podcast, and I've become a huge fan of listening to that on YouTube.
You said his
Uh,
name was Simon Jones. Is it
Simon Jones,
Simon Jones? Okay.
Air Quality Matters. Yeah, very good. Very good stuff. All right. Well, hey, Bernie, man, this has been great. We met via LinkedIn and
Yep.
emailed each other a couple of rounds. I definitely look forward to meeting you in person. This was amazing. I really appreciate it, and I'm definitely following your work. And I encourage people to follow you as well because I think you're onto something here.
Likewise, it's great meeting you, and I'll follow the projects and work that you're talking about as well. It's very interesting.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Aaron.
All right. Have a good one.